Over the last few months, I admittedly haven't been posting videos all that frequently, a rate of maybe one every 2 to 3 weeks. The reason for this is in part due to a busy schedule that involves balancing a full-time job, parenthood, and all the other various chores and tasks necessary to function in society, and also gardening itself is a time-consuming and laborious activity, and I've been extra busy recently with a number of garden upgrades and overall prep for the upcoming season. So today's video is going to be a bit of a journal entry detailing these upgrades and showing the state of my garden as we enter the spring and summer season. Last spring, on a bit of a whim, I installed a makeshift quick veggie garden in my front yard. I just tilled and amended a strip of yard following the curvature of an unnecessary concrete circle that exists for presumable reasons. It started taking off a bit, but the sprawling and irregular layout of the garden made installing shade cloth impractical, and the garden essentially burnt to a crisp during the first triple-digit heat wave that we got in June. This was the sad state of the space in January of this year. Now, luckily, I did have a bit of a windfall that came in around Christmas, and I was able to earmark some of it to upgrade to a raised bed system out front. So I got to work. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the bed construction process as I have a number of past videos up on that topic. The important point here is that I was able to build 4 3x6 foot raised beds for a total of about $250. I then had to order soil, which was almost as expensive. Interestingly, this time the soil was delivered in these 1-yard giant bags, while usually they just dump it in a pile in my driveway, but it's all good. I managed to get the beds filled in just a few hours working alone, which is not too shabby for a middle-aged fat guy. And here's the end result. I kept some of that curved patch of tilled lawn, but reduced it in length a bit, and planted in some low-maintenance, heat and sun-tolerant succulents and perennials. Hopefully, they'll grow to fill the space out before too terribly long. I planted this Mexican lime tree here as a sort of centerpiece for the space. Along the back row of beds, I have some zucchini in the wine barrels, 3 butterbush winter squash in this close bed here, and then 3 Table King acorn squash in the second bed. In the front row of beds, I have a bush pickle cucumber variety in the wine barrels, and an assortment of hot peppers in the next bed here. These are admittedly looking a little bit shabby, but I'm not too worried about them at this point. The initial leaves are looking rough, but the new growth emerging from the nodes between the leaves and stems are looking pretty healthy. If past years are any indication, these will recover and take off once the weather warms up a little, and then I'll be swimming in more hot peppers than I can really deal with. In this bed, I have all poblano peppers, and they're actually mostly looking pretty good. I'm hoping to harvest enough this year to try making my own chili powder. I'm going to let them ripen all the way up to the point where they're red for the most part, and give that a try, see how it goes. All right, onto the backyard gardens. So this year I've mulched about half of my gardens with straw, as shown here, and the other half with a partially composted chicken mulch mixture. I would have done the whole thing with the wood mulch, as it's highly effective and perpetually available to us at no additional cost, but I want to reserve these beds here for potatoes in the future, and it's pretty much impossible to harvest potatoes from a wood mulched garden without inadvertently working in a substantial amount of wood chips, thus tying up nitrogen. So I went with straw. Now, even though these bales are touted as being seed-free, they're anything but, so I employed a trick I learned over on the Millennial Gardener channel and left them out in the rain for a few months to germinate any seeds prior to applying to my gardens. Hopefully this cuts down on the amount of weeding I have to do. For the beds in the left half of my garden, I mulched with a blend of partially composted used wood shavings from our chicken pen, kitchen scraps, and other various green matter. And at the time of application, the mixture had a nice, sticky, almost clay-like consistency and was absolutely teeming with redworms. Not only will the stuff act as a great moisture barrier, as it continues to break down, it will add nutrients to the soil. Now, if anyone is wondering about the small wooden frames around the bases of the plants, these are just partitions to keep the wood mulch out of my way during transplant so I don't, over time, till too much wood into the soil. I wound up transplanting my tomatoes on March 23rd, which was about a week sooner than I would have preferred, but the tomatoes were once again outgrowing their pots in spite of me starting them way later than I did last year. I swear one of these years I'm actually going to get the timing right on this whole thing. Unfortunately, we were hit with a late 5-day stretch of chilly but non-frosty weather after transplant that I fear might have adversely affected some of my tomatoes. More on that in a minute. An addition I made to my indeterminate tomato beds this year is a string trellis system that just consists of some taut lines strung between wooden T-posts at either ends of the bed. From these, I'm hanging tomato hooks as seen here. Now, I'll likely go into a little more detail on how these work in a future video, but there are honestly a lot of videos already on YouTube about how to employ this system. Anyway, in this series of beds, I have a new to me paste tomato variety called Canestrino de Luca. And based on the pictures I've seen, these don't have the oblong, egg-shaped fruits typical to most paste tomato varieties, and instead look more like little heirloom slicers. I've read Canestrino is actually more or less Italian for little basket, which is in reference to the shape of the tomatoes themselves. I'm kind of throwing caution to the wind this year and mostly growing new varieties as opposed to sticking with my tried and true tomatoes that have proven their mettle in my climate. Really hope I don't come to regret this decision. And in between my tomatoes, I've planted a handful of Orient Express eggplants. These are fairly compact, so I don't really expect them to contribute too much to any overcrowding. Over here I have my cherry tomatoes planted, and these are 2 black cherries and 1 each of Sun Gold and Isis Candy. Now the foliage on these is starting to look nice, full, and healthy, but the stalks are troublingly thin. These were not leggy as seedlings, so I'm surprised that the stems are taking so long to bulk up. It's definitely a situation that I'm going to monitor closely. In these blue beds, I have another new to me variety called Super Sue. These are described as a very heat-tolerant canning tomato, so hopefully they'll thrive over Sacramento's relentlessly brutal summer. And so far, these are the most vigorous and robust of all the tomatoes I have planted out. In these beds, I'm also growing some Boston pickling cucumber plants up the trellises at the ends of the beds. I said I wasn't going to bother growing these this year as they tend to struggle in the heat, but I really like the way they look in a pickle jar, so I just couldn't resist planting a few. Now, these beds here where I have all of my heirloom slicers is where things get a little bit iffy. So I have 3 varieties here: Cherokee Purple, Virginia Sweets, and Zapotec Pleated. Now, most of my Cherokee Purples are doing okay, but one stalled out completely after transplant. Now, I had some backups going, so I snuck them in the spaces in between the older plants. If all or most of them recover and take off, I'll just prune them back to 1 or 2 productive stems to prevent overcrowding. Unfortunately, half of my Virginia Sweets and Zapotecs have stalled out. Now, they could have suffered some chilling injury during the cold snap we had a few weeks ago, but I've had tomatoes out through similar conditions in years past, and I didn't have any problems. It's a hard truth that not every plant in a garden is going to survive to bear fruit. It just stings a lot more when you don't have all that many plants to begin with. Next up, I have my winter squashes. I'm really hoping to have a good squash harvest this year, but the slugs and whiteflies clearly aren't going to make that an easy task for me. The squash in these beds are a bush habit variety called Golden Nugget, and 2 are doing great, 1 kind of mediocre, and the other not so great. I didn't get my slug bait down quite fast enough, and what happened with this one is the smallest slugs I've ever seen, they're maybe no longer than a 1/4 inch, munched the very ends of the new growth on the plant and wound up stunting it a bit. I'm not sure if this one will recover and bear fruit, which is frustrating to say the least because I only have 4 of these to begin with. These 3 plants are an acorn squash variety called Thelma Sanders sweet potato, and they're described as a beige-colored acorn squash as opposed to the typical green. So far, so good on these, but they look like they're going to be more of a short vine habit than a bush habit, which is not a real problem. I'm just going to have to come up with a plan to wrangle them a bit before too long. These 3 here are butterbush squash, and they've also been hit pretty hard by those mini slugs I was talking about earlier. I'm not convinced these will recover and take off. I do have some backup started in case I need to replace them, and machadas are a more heat-tolerant species of squash, so as long as replacements are well underway by mid-May, I should be alright. These 2 beds here are planted out with a bush Delicata variety, and they're looking pretty good except for some silvering of the leaves, which indicates some whitefly nymphs might be at work. I've been treating all of my squashes with an insecticidal soap every 2 weeks just to keep the white fly populations in check. It's definitely way easier to treat small young plants to prevent an infestation than it is to treat a fully grown plant after things have already gotten out of hand. Here I have a pair of Rio Grande paste tomatoes, and the Rio Grande is by far my favorite paste variety so far, as they're perfectly suited to the Sacramento climate, which often has wild temperature swings between day and night, even in the summer. And these are just a few backup tomatoes in case others fail, 2 Rio Grandes and a Cherokee Purple. As a paranoid and obsessive gardener, I always assume the worst and have replacements ready to go if needed. Here I have my sweet peppers, a mix of Marconi and Cubanelle. I've really struggled trying to grow bell peppers in the past, and I read that bullhorn-shaped pepper varieties like the Marconi often do better in hot, dry climates. Fingers crossed on that. And at the end of the bed, I have another pair of Rio Grande tomatoes. Along the back of the bed, under the trellis, I've direct sown some asparagus beans, which are a great hot climate alternative to string beans. And I've planted some Armenian cucumbers, which are technically a kind of muskmelon, and a great hot climate alternative to standard cucumbers. I'm going to take a quick break from talking about vegetables to appreciate some of the flowers we have blooming. This sage plant is in full bloom and absolutely out of control. I'll likely have to prune this back a bit once the flowers drop and are no longer a draw for pollinators. This giant California poppy was a nice surprise, as it volunteered from seeds dropped by a far less impressive plant we had in the same spot last year. It's adding a lot of vibrant color to an otherwise fairly drab early season garden. Well, lemon blossoms aren't the most visually stunning flower. You can't beat their scent. It's definitely one of the more pleasant smells of spring here in Sacramento. And they almost make up for all the Bradford pear stench in the region. And in this corner, we have a flowering aloe plant backed by the magenta flowers of the rock purslane that has largely taken over this space. Hummingbirds seem to really love the aloe, and it's kind of nice to watch them from our kitchen table. Back to veggies. I have several robust potato plants going that I started from seed potatoes in January. I recently pulled a couple of test potatoes and found they're still about golf ball sized, so they have a little longer to go. I have at least another month before the weather will get too hot for potatoes, which is plenty of time for fast-growing Yukon Golds to put on a little more size. Now, the potatoes in these grow bags here are already drying out quickly and requiring frequent watering. I definitely prefer hard-walled containers in my climate, but I had a surplus of these and a surplus of seed potatoes, so I just tossed them in there to see what would happen. And finally, I have a small patio garden where I've planted a handful of surplus, maybe overflow plants. I have yet another potato, and then in this bed I have some nasturtium, oregano, and basil, a pair of bush habit cucumbers, another pair of eggplant, and 2 Anaheim chili peppers. All right, time for a little revenge. And so that's the state of my gardens as of late April. And while I'm a little concerned over the health of some of my tomato and squash plants, and things overall seem a little behind where they were at this time last year, I'm trying not to assume the worst. There's still a little time between now and the arrival of the murder heat for things to really rally and take off. Now, the rational side of me knows that with gardening, not every year is going to be a banner year. Unfortunately, the emotional side of me finds that fact thoroughly unacceptable. So, until next time, let's really hope it all doesn't die.